She was 20 years old the winter her uncle put her trunk on the porch and told her the house was no longer hers to sleep in. Her name was Clara Ainsworth, and the man who cast her out was Warwick Doyle, her mother's half-brother, who had inherited the family's modest holdings in Cheyenne and decided a niece with no dowry and no husband was a debt he no longer wished to carry. She left with $11 sewn into the hem of her coat, a tin of her mother's sewing needles, and nothing else that could be called her own. When she heard that the county was selling off the wreckage of a settler train that had vanished in the mountains 40 years before, 6 wagons, still loaded, found rotting at the mouth of a valley nobody had dared resettle. She paid $4 for the lot, sight unseen, because $4 was what she had left after a week of bread. The men at the land office laughed as they signed the paper over to her. They called it a fool's purchase, cursed ground, wagons that belonged to the dead. What none of them knew, what Clara herself would not learn for many weeks, was that sealed beneath the false floor of the lead wagon lay a promise that 40 vanished families had carried into the mountains and never had the chance to keep. A promise that would not only change the shape of Clara's life, but would in time give an entire forgotten valley back its name. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Clara Ainsworth. If you have ever been told that what you carry is worthless, that your name and your labor do not matter to the people who are supposed to love you, we are glad you are here with us tonight, and if this is your first time sitting by this fire with us, we would be honored if you'd follow along or subscribe, so you never miss the next story we have to tell. Clara had not always been a girl with nothing. She had been raised in a house that smelled of cedar shavings and lamp oil, the daughter of a wheelwright named Thomas Ainsworth, a careful, quiet man who had taught her, almost without meaning to, the patient language of wood and iron. From the time she was 6 years old, she had sat on an overturned bucket in his shop in Laramie. Watching him fit spokes into a hub with the tenderness other men reserved for courting, and she had absorbed, the way children absorb weather, the rhythm of his craft, how a wheel had to be built to bear weight it would never see coming, how a wagon that looked finished on the outside could still be rotten at the axle if you did not know where to look. Her mother, Delphine, had died of a fever when Clara was 12, and after that, her father had kept her close in the shop rather than send her to relations, teaching her not only wheelwrighting, but the reading of ledgers, the tallying of debts, the quiet dignity of a man who paid what he owed and expected the same of others. It was, Thomas used to say, the only inheritance he could promise her for certain. Not land, not money, but the ability to look at a broken thing and see what it had been built to become again. He told her once, on a spring evening with sawdust still in his beard, that the world was full of people who threw away what they did not understand, and that a person who could see value where others saw ruin would never truly be poor. Clara had believed him the way children believe their fathers, entirely, and had carried the words folded inside her the way she later carried her $11, close to the body, where no one could take them. Her father died when she was 17, thrown from a wagon he himself had built, in an accident that the town coroner called plain bad luck, and that Clara, in her private grief, never quite stopped turning over. With no mother, no brothers, and a father's small estate that turned out to be mostly debt once the shop's creditors came forward, she had gone to live with her Uncle Warwick in Cheyenne, the only kin willing to take her in, though willing was a generous word for a man who resented every meal she ate at his table. For 3 years she made herself useful in ways that cost her nothing to give and everything to endure, mending harness, keeping his accounts straighter than his hired man ever had, nursing his children through fevers her own mother might have recognized. She told herself it was temporary, that she was building toward something, though she could not have said what. She learned, in that house, to make herself small and steady at once, to keep her hands busy and her opinions to herself, and she told herself that patience, like a well-built wheel, was simply weight distributed so that it did not break you. It was a lesson she would need soon enough, though not in the way she expected. The fall, when it came, was not sudden so much as it was the last turn of a wheel that had been loosening for years. Warwick Doyle had never liked being reminded, by Clara's presence, of the sister who had married beneath her station, nor of the brother-in-law whose skill with his hands had earned more genuine respect in Laramie than Warwick's speculation in land had ever earned him in Cheyenne. When a business venture of Warwick's collapsed that winter, a freight contract gone sour, a partner who vanished with what capital remained, he came home in the mood of a man looking for something to blame, and Clara, quiet and unmarried and eating his bread, was the nearest target that would not fight back. He told her, not unkindly at first, and then with less and less patience as she tried to reason with him, that the house could no longer support an extra mouth, that she was old enough to marry or old enough to work, and that either arrangement would suit him better than her continued presence. When she asked for a little time to write to her father's old customers in Laramie, to see whether any of them might take her on, he laughed and said the wheelwright's daughter could go and be a wheelwright herself, for all he cared. Within the week her trunk was on the porch. She spent 3 nights in the back room of a boarding house that took in seamstresses, mending shirts for pennies apiece under a lamp that smelled of rendered fat, and it was there, listening to 2 freight drivers argue over supper about a strange parcel of land the county was finally clearing off its books, that she first heard the words that would change everything: the Belhaven Wagons. The men spoke of it the way men speak of ghost stories they only half believe. A settler company of some 40 families, bound in the spring of 1851 for a valley 2 days' ride northwest. A valley the company itself had christened Belhaven before they had ever laid eyes on it, so certain were they of the life they meant to build there. The train had simply never arrived. No survivors had ever been found, no bodies beyond a few scattered graves near a ridge the rescue parties called Widow's Break. And the wagons themselves, 6 of the original 11, the rest presumed burned or buried in a slide, had been discovered years later, half swallowed by the mountainside where the trail forked wrong, their contents undisturbed by anything but time and weather, as if the families had simply stepped out of them and never come back. For 40 years the county had let the wagons sit, unwilling to spend money moving them, and unable to sell land that local superstition had marked as cursed. Now, with new rail surveys coming through, someone in the land office had decided the whole parcel, wagons, salvage rights, and 40 acres of scrubland around them, could finally be auctioned off as a curiosity, and Clara, sitting in the corner of that boarding house with a needle still in her hand, felt something in her chest tighten with a recognition she could not yet name. She thought of her father's voice. A person who could see value where others saw ruin would never truly be poor. She had $11. She had a lifetime of knowing what a wagon's bones could still say about the people who built it. The next morning, before she could talk herself out of it, she walked to the land office and asked to see the notice for herself. The clerk who took her $4 did so with the particular smirk of a man who believed he was being paid to watch a fool make a mistake. He told her, not because she asked, but because he enjoyed the telling, that no one in 3 counties had touched those wagons in 40 years, that the mountain folk said Belhaven Valley was a place where luck went to die, and that she would be lucky herself if the wood wasn't too rotten to burn for kindling. Clara signed the paper anyway, in a hand steadier than she felt, and walked out into the cold with a piece of parchment that made her, for the first time since her father's death, the sole owner of something in the world. It took her 4 days to reach the valley on foot, and by the charity of a mail rider who was heading half that way, and when she finally crested the ridge and looked down at what she had bought, she understood at once why the county had been so eager to be rid of it and so certain no one sane would want it. The 6 wagons sat exactly where they had been found, canted at odd angles in a stand of aspen that had grown up around and through them in 4 decades, their canvas long rotted to gray rags, their wheels, her father's trade, her own eye immediately drawn there, sunk deep into soil that had frozen and thawed around them 100 times. It should have looked like a graveyard. Instead, standing there in the thin mountain light, Clara felt something closer to recognition, as if she had been sent for. She spent her first days simply learning the wagons the way her father had taught her to learn any wounded thing, running her hands along axles and hubs, testing which timbers still held and which crumbled to punk at a touch. And it was in the process of this patient examination, clearing rot from beneath the lead wagon's bed in search of a sound plank to stand on, that her fingers found the seam that should not have been there. A false floor, built with a wheelwright's precision into the wagon bed itself, hidden beneath what looked like ordinary flooring boards, but was in truth a shallow compartment no wider than a coffin and no deeper than a forearm, sealed with pitch and iron pins that had rusted nearly through. It took her the better part of an afternoon, working with a borrowed hatchet and more patience than force, to lift the boards free, and when she did, the smell that rose to meet her was not decay, but cedar. Cedar and old paper, and something faintly metallic beneath. And inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow kept the mountain damp at bay for 40 years, she found a ledger bound in leather, a canvas sack heavier than its size suggested, and a single letter, sealed in wax bearing a mark she did not recognize, addressed not to any one person, but simply, in a strong, careful hand, to whoever finds this. Clara did not open the letter that first night. She sat with it in her lap by a small fire built from deadfall, turning it over, feeling the strange weight of being the first living soul in 40 years to hold something meant, in some sense, for her, whoever she turned out to be. When she finally broke the seal by the gray light of the following morning, the words inside undid something in her that she had not known was still tightly wound. The letter was from a man named Josiah Renner, who identified himself as the company's elected captain, and it explained, in the plain and urgent hand of a man writing what he feared might be his final testament, that the Belhaven Company had not simply been a collection of families seeking land, but a covenant, that every one of the 40 households traveling together had pooled what money and goods they had, some $6,000 in coin and dust carried in the very sack she now held, along with a signed charter promising that once they reached the valley, the land would be divided equally among every family regardless of what each had contributed, so that no man's greater wealth would buy him a greater share, and no widow's poverty would leave her with less than her neighbors. It was, Josiah Renner had written, an experiment in fairness that some men back east had mocked as foolish and dangerous, and it was precisely because of that mockery, he confessed, that the company had kept the arrangement quiet, traveling under the protection of a guide who had been recommended to them by a Cheyenne land speculator eager, or so it seemed now, too eager, to see them settled quickly and quietly. The letter grew hurried toward its end, the hand less steady, mentioning a dispute with the guide over the trail, a fork the man insisted upon against Renner's own reading of the map, and a fear, plainly stated, that they had been led wrong on purpose. Renner had hidden the ledger and the coin in the lead wagon's floor. He wrote, in case the worst came to pass, so that if any soul ever found the company's wagons, they would also find proof of what the Belhaven families had meant to build, and his final line, underlined twice, so that their promise to one another might still someday be kept, even if they themselves could not keep it. Clara sat with that letter for a long while before she could make herself move again. She thought of her own $11, of the door shut against her, of a lifetime of being told what she carried did not matter, and she understood with sudden and total clarity that she had not stumbled onto treasure. She had stumbled onto a debt owed to the dead, and that debt was now, whether she wanted it or not, hers to settle. The ledger, when she studied it properly over the following days, told her far more than the letter alone could. Josiah Renner had been a careful record-keeper, and the book held not only the tally of coin each family had contributed, but a full roll of the company itself, 40 names, ages, trades, the towns they had come from, the children they had brought with them, even a rough plat of how the valley's land was to be divided once they arrived, each family's plot marked out in Renner's own patient hand, as though the drawing alone might make the future real. Clara realized, reading it, that she recognized several of the surnames, not from any personal acquaintance, but from the county itself, families who had scattered after the disaster. Some remaining in the region under new circumstances, their descendants now scratching out livings as tenant farmers or hired hands on land that, by any fair reading of this ledger and this charter, ought rightfully to have included a share of Belhaven Valley itself. And it was in cross, referencing those names against what she began, cautiously, to ask around about in the nearest town of Hartwell Crossing, that Clara first heard the name that turned her quiet grief into something sharper. Silas Corwin. Silas Corwin was, by 1891, the wealthiest man in 3 counties, a land baron whose holdings had grown. Townsfolk said with the particular admiration people reserve for successful men, from almost nothing in the space of a single generation. What Clara learned, piecing it together from old-timers at the Hartwell Crossing Mercantile, who remembered more than they realized they were telling her, was that Silas Corwin's father, a young trail guide in 1851 named Amos Corwin, had been the very man hired to lead the Belhaven Company into the mountains, and that Amos Corwin had returned from that expedition alone, claiming the settlers had dismissed him early over a dispute and that he knew nothing of their fate, before using money no one could quite account for to buy up, over the following years, a substantial portion of the land surrounding the valley the Belhaven families had died trying to reach. It was Amos Corwin's son who now held title to nearly everything in the valley's shadow, who leased land back to the descendants of families his own father may have doomed, who was, in short, the last man on earth who would welcome a young woman arriving with a ledger, a charter, and a letter, proving that the valley's true history did not match the one his family had spent 40 years quietly writing. Clara understood, once she pieced this together, that she could not simply present her discovery to the county and expect justice to follow. Silas Corwin held influence over the land office, the local judge, even the newspaper in Hartwell Crossing, and a girl of 20 with no family and no standing, claiming that a respected man's father had led 40 families to their deaths and then profited from it, would be dismissed or worse before she finished her first sentence. So she did what her father had taught her without ever meaning to teach her anything so dangerous. She worked patiently, quietly, testing the structure before she trusted it to bear weight. She began, discreetly, seeking out the descendants named in Renner's ledger, one family at a time, careful never to reveal too much before she understood who might be trustworthy and who might, out of fear or dependence on Corwin's goodwill, betray her. She found a Hattie Marsh working as a laundress in Hartwell Crossing, granddaughter of a woman named on the Belhaven roll, and Adele Whitcomb, a blacksmith's apprentice, whose grandfather's name sat plainly in Renner's own hand, as having contributed $400, a fortune for the time, toward the company's shared purse. One by one, carefully, over the span of several weeks, Clara gathered a quiet coalition of the forgotten. People who had grown up poor on land their families might rightfully have shared. And she began, with their help, to rebuild the wagons themselves as a kind of proof, restoring wheels, hubs, and beds with her own trained hands, so that when the time came to bring this before the county, she would not arrive with only paper. She would arrive with the wagons themselves, whole enough to be believed. Silas Corwin, of course, did not remain ignorant for long. Word travels in small counties the way water travels downhill, finding every low place, and it was not many weeks before a man in Corwin's employ arrived at the valley to inform Clara. With the particular courtesy men use when they mean to threaten you, that her salvage claim did not extend to the surrounding land, that the county had made an error in selling her anything at all given the parcel's disputed history, and that Mr. Corwin would be willing to buy back her interest in the wagons for a sum considerably more generous than the $4 she had paid, provided she vacated the valley within the week and troubled no one further with old stories best left buried with the dead who told them. Clara understood the offer for what it was, not generosity, but fear dressed as generosity, and she declined it as politely as she was able, which only hastened what came next. Fences she had never authorized appeared along the valley's eastern edge. A rumor began circulating in Hartwell Crossing that the girl living among the ghost wagons was not quite right in the head, touched by grief or worse, and ought not to be trusted or aided by decent folk. When Del Whitcomb spoke too openly in the Mercantile about his grandfather's name in an old ledger, he found himself abruptly without work. His employer suddenly unwilling to extend credit he had extended freely for years. Clara recognized in all of it her uncle's particular cruelty, grown larger and more practiced. The cruelty of a man protecting what he had convinced himself was rightfully his by simply outlasting the people who might say otherwise, and she felt the old fear rise in her, the fear of being small against something large. But she thought of Josiah Renner's hurried hand, underlined twice, so that their promise to one another might still someday be kept, and she found that fear, this time, had somewhere solid to stand against. She spent the following month building her case as carefully as she had ever built a wheel, understanding that a single weak joint could bring the whole structure down. She wrote to the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne directly, rather than trusting the local one Corwin's influence reached, enclosing careful copies of the ledger's roll and Renner's letter, and requesting formally an inquiry into the original 1851 survey records for the valley. Records that, if Amos Corwin had indeed misled the company deliberately, might still show discrepancies between the trail he had claimed to take and the one the wagons had actually followed. She gathered sworn statements, however humble, from Hattie Marsh and Del Whitcomb and 6 other descendants she had by then found, each attesting to family stories long dismissed as tall tales that now, set beside Renner's ledger, formed too consistent a pattern to be coincidence. Stories of a guide who had argued fiercely against the company's own reading of the map, who had insisted upon a fork that led not toward the valley, but toward the narrow, treacherous pass above Widow's Break, where an early snow that autumn had likely caught them exposed and unable to turn back. And she finished, in the final days before the matter came to a hearing, the restoration of the lead wagon itself, replacing its rotted wheels with new ones built in the same style Renner's own company would have used, so that when she finally brought her case before the Territorial Land Commissioner who traveled out to Hartwell Crossing that spring, she did not arrive merely with an argument. She arrived with a wagon that could, once again, be pulled. The hearing, when it came, was not the dramatic reckoning of a courtroom, but the quieter, more grinding business of a territorial commissioner examining documents at a long table in the back of the Hartwell Crossing Land Office. With Silas Corwin seated stiffly at one end insisting, with the confidence of a man unused to being contradicted, that the girl's claims were the fanciful invention of someone hoping to extort a settled and respectable family. But the survey records Clara had requested arrived in time, and they told a story Corwin could not talk his way around. The original 1851 trail notes, filed by the territorial surveyor who had marked the route months before the company ever set out, showed clearly that the valley approach lay along the southern ridge, not the northern pass where the wagons had ultimately been found, a pass that led, as anyone reading the terrain could see, directly toward the narrow break where the company had vanished. Combined with Renner's letter, the ledger's precise roll of names and contributions, and the sworn word of 8 descendants whose family stories all converged on the same guide, the same argument over the same fork in the trail. The weight of it settled over the room like the first real cold of autumn. Silas Corwin did not confess to anything that day, and perhaps he genuinely did not know the full truth of what his father had done 40 years before. But the commissioner ruled, based on the evidence, that the original Belhaven Charter, the equal division of land among the 40 founding families, was a legitimate and binding document that predated any subsequent claim to the valley, including any claim descended from Amos Corwin's own opportunistic purchases in the years following the disaster. Silas Corwin's hold on Belhaven Valley itself, the very ground the lost train had died trying to reach, was voided. What quiet justice fell upon him beyond that loss of land, the commission did not concern itself with. But it was noted, in the months that followed, that a man who built his fortune on land he could no longer prove he owned found fewer doors in the territory quite so willing to open for him as they once had, and that the respectable silence which had protected his father's name for 40 years no longer held quite the same shape. What mattered far more to Clara than Corwin's diminishment was what came after. With the charter recognized, she oversaw, alongside the small coalition of descendants she had gathered, the division of Belhaven Valley according to Josiah Renner's own 40-year-old plat. Each family's plot marked out precisely where his careful hand had drawn it, as though he had somehow trusted that someone, someday, would come to finish what he started. The coin in the canvas sack, $6,000 in old currency and dust that Clara might easily have kept entirely for herself and told no one, she instead placed into a common fund, exactly as Renner's charter had specified, to be used for the building of a schoolhouse and a well at the valley's center, so that the children of families who had waited 40 years for a promise to be kept would grow up on ground their grandparents had died trying to reach. She kept for herself only what the charter allowed any single household. One plot, no larger and no better than any other family's. And it was there, on a rise overlooking the valley floor, that she began to build, with her father's tools and her father's patient eye, a home from timber she milled herself. And so it is that Clara Ainsworth, the girl who was told at 20 that she was worth nothing more than $11 and a shut door, became the woman who finished what 40 families and one honest captain had died trying to begin. She had bought a curse, the clerk told her. $4 worth of rotted wood that no sane person would touch, and what she had found inside it was not treasure in the way the word is usually meant, but something rarer and harder to spend, a promise, kept 40 years late. That no family's worth should be measured by what they arrived with, only by what they were willing to build together. She thought often, in the years that followed, of her father's words in that sawdust-scented shop, that a person who could see value where others saw ruin would never truly be poor, and she understood at last that he had not only been teaching her how to read a broken wheel, He had been teaching her how to read the whole shape of a life left for dead, and to trust that even the most abandoned thing might still be carrying, somewhere beneath its rotted floor, a promise worth keeping. Thank you for spending this evening with Clara Ainsworth and the valley she brought back from 40 years of silence. If her story moved you, we would be so grateful if you would share it with someone who needs to hear that being overlooked is not the same as being worthless. And if you have a moment, we would love to know. What is a time you found real value in something everyone else had already written off? Tell us in the comments. We truly do read every one. Until next time, stay close.